to the second episode in our mission track workshop. We're calling it George is Curious, and I'm in conversation again with my colleague and friend, the Reverend Dr. Lindsay Armstrong, who is the Executive Director of New Church Development in the Greater Atlanta area. And we're talking about 6 shifts that have happened in mindset, and Lindsay is using her research where she's looked at new worshiping communities and how they differ from the institutional church's kind of ethos. And the last time we were together, we discussed 2 of those shifts. The first one is a demand. Churches started or sustained in response to demand versus churches which start and sustain in response to a meaning-making exercise, creating an opportunity for people to find meaningful activity. And then the second one is from hierarchical to participatory decision-making. And Lindsay, welcome. And I guess we are into our next shift, aren't we?
Yes, shift number 3. Though,
right. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So shift 3, it's from one of the shifts that I'm seeing that is true in church and business and needed in the emerging era. It's not so much the shift number 2, which was about organization and how we design the organization of our churches, the move from hierarchy to. This one is how we engage our environment. And the shift is from hard to permeable boundaries. So in the age of institutions, there were really hard boundaries regarding who does what, who should be involved with which conversations. In some ways, you kind of had to earn your way in. In an age of access, there are permeable boundaries and conversations and co-creation. And this is a decided shift. Many people expect to be able to have a seat at the table and to be involved with co-creating something. And this is an interesting shift for a lot of churches because it involves how we do our own internal relationships within ourselves. It's also how we relate to the people around us, the network around us, both, sure, the presbytery, one another, but also the other churches in the area, nonprofits in the area, etc. There used to be kind of hard boundaries, but now the invitation is open up, co-create, be in conversation, have permeable boundaries. I can definitely share a few ways I'm seeing this play out in churches, but I'll pause first, George Curious, and see if that makes sense, this shift.
I think we can relate to it, and I think if we're struggling with anything culturally and in terms of worldview in Southern Africa, it is to try to understand how the church can have permeable boundaries, because our structures are pretty much in place, although in recent years there have been dramatic changes in the traditional structures of the Presbyterian Church. One of the ones I so enjoyed being involved with, and this was my doctoral research in Atlanta, was to try to work out a participatory decision-making model. And that was a big step for us. And to unlearn what you call Robert's rules and what we call the Westminster parliamentary system was a very difficult thing. But we made that transition, and the church at the General Assembly level still uses a participatory style decision-making model. And so I think that's a great thing. But these hierarchies, where the minister is right at the top and the session, and the church leaders, and in many of our rural and township churches, the associations, the men's association, the women, the youth, some of which have legacy coming from the anti-apartheid movement and so on. It's very difficult to conceive of a permeable boundary. Those are very kind of set in stone. And yet I find younger people in the church today are very keen on being involved, and they battle to get into those hierarchies that are very firmly guarded, and it frustrates them, and it may even cause them to go over to other denominations where there aren't these strong boundaries. So I think this is going to be an important discussion for all of us as we look to trying to work out what church is going to be like not only in the future, but right now.
I love it. I love it. I want to hear more, George. You can decide when that happens, but I want to hear more about how you've revolutionized your decision-making processes. For now, I can give you an example of a church that is really interesting. They're called Soul Soup, and appealing to the early house churches. They are a church which meets in homes, and they come together in a larger building where all the small groups get together, a few times every month, but largely they meet every week in homes around tables where soup, song, conversation, worship, and their week is shared.
Yes.
And every week, all those who will gather are invited to share in an open online setting the questions they believe God is asking them to consider. The questions are then sorted, written into cards, one or two of which will be drawn at random and discussed when they gather on Saturday nights. So there's a structure and rhythm to the evening, and loosely it actually follows the structure and rhythm of our Reformed Presbyterian worship services, but there's a fluidity about who is leading and how, as all are expected to be fully engaged. So everybody comes, everybody helps make the soup, chop things, that kind of a thing. The leaders for the night are those whose napkins have the questions rolled into them, and the conversations are deep and personal and transformative. And very few people miss more than one weekly gathering every few months. And together they decide their activities as a community, when group size or geography or travel time makes it so that they should start another group. They have a lot of different dinner groups that are growing rapidly, and open conversation, co-creation is the norm. And this community is really gathered around a project of healing. This community is people who have been hurt by the church, who have felt excluded by the church, who have been directly damaged by the church. And the organizer of the group, she went to seminary. She could be an ordained pastor, but she really finds it important not to be ordained because she believes ordination sets up unnecessary hierarchy and division within the body and obscures this idea that ministry is the work of Christ shared by all united with Christ in baptism. And so this is a group of people who have been hurt by hard boundaries and closed systems. And they are a lived exploration, soul soup, about what might a church that attempts to practice a sharing of authority and community look like. And they actually believe that that posture, that way of being church in the world, is essential to God's work of promoting authentic personhood, of fostering inclusive communities based on just relationships. She thinks it's absolutely critical to developing respect and active care for one another and all of creation. And to Soul Soup, permeable boundaries, open conversation, co-creation of the kind of church they need in their life is not just a new and kind of funky thing to try. It's actually, they think, a foundational Christian posture modeled by Jesus himself and called forth by the Holy Spirit, who is still breaking boundaries and healing division and righting injustice and bringing wholeness and healing to the world. I could tell you several more stories if you want. I want to be mindful of time.
Well, it's a fascinating idea because, as I mentioned before, I think we're pretty much stuck in the Southern African context in a very structured environment, about who should do what, when, and how, and who has the authority to do this, that, and the next thing. From the worship service itself, I remember one year, some years ago, when I was in Bryanston, I decided, well, with the church council's permission, that in the month of April, we would have only lay persons preach. So the first Sunday went by and there were no complaints. Everybody was smiling, and it was a novelty to have, a member of the council, or I can't remember who it was. It could have been a lay preacher. It was a member of the congregation preach. And the second Sunday went by and there were a few frowns. And the third Sunday, somebody said to me at the door, "What do we actually pay you for?" You know, all this money that you're getting, all this money that you're getting, what's it actually for? So it was hard. I had to say to them, and then there was a huge temptation to end it now, put an end to this thing. And I said, no. Not only is it not going to end, but every April from now on, we're going to have lay people preach all 4 Sundays or 5 of the month. And people found that very hard, because in their minds, the minister was a preacher first and foremost. You know, whatever else needed to be done, that was fine. But if the minister was in the pulpit, no complaints. You know, and other things, you know, veiled compliments like, you know, but you're such a great preacher, you know, and I really.
Which you are, come on.
Well, no, I'm not, I mean, I'm a very ordinary preacher, but the fact is, you know, the manipulation that came into this equation to just get us back onto what we know and understand. We know the lines, we understand them, we know who does what, who's who in the zoo, as we say, and don't mess with it. Don't mess with it. And what you're asking us to do, Lindsay, is to mess with it on purpose. Because we're in a brand new era, and it can do beautiful things for us.
Yeah. Well, and I'm also asking you to mess with it according to the culture and vocation of your church.
Right.
I mean, there are some churches that should not have a free-for-all with worship leadership, or have their worship meet over dinner, or, I mean, there is a personality and culture of each church, but there's also, I mean, going back to session 1, in your conversations where you were talking about the deep meaning, the vocation of the particular church, and you start with the why. I mean, if a church is not just something that we were working so hard on because we love the church, but is in fact God's instrument, then there is a why to existing. We are called into being as any individual church or the larger church for particular purposes as God's instrument, because God is going to do something in the world, in us, with us, and hopefully through us. And so the how to play with these co-creation, open boundaries piece will definitely also reflect the purpose and vocation of your church.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think worship is a great place because it starts to signal the body of Christ not as a participatory kind of thing. And if worship is the center of the church, having a participatory feel and vibe really models what we want to see in the rest of the church. But there will be places where worship isn't the place for that. I mean, it can come up in even smaller things. Like there's a church that decided not to use the language of membership because they felt like the language of membership evokes this kind of entitlement, where it's kind of like a consumerist entitlement. Like members have been screened and passed the test on whether they believe the right things, behave the right way, they have the right to vote in congregational meetings, they have access to special services and privileged attention from the clergy and the other church leaders, etc. And they intentionally shifted because they wanted to signal this participatory way of being, where things are really a conversation rather than a message. They use partnership language.
Right.
And now everybody associated with the church is a partner, and that's less concerned about believing the right things, behaving the right way before you fully participate and belong. Partners are already part of the community. They're part of the church's mission. It emphasizes connective relationships, mutual obligation. It emphasizes covenant, be more concerned with welcoming people and being alongside and helping us explore our relationship with God. It's about break into another sermon. It's about loving God together, serving one another, pursuing a common mission, etc. And so even in the language that we use, we can shift from hard boundaries about who's in, who does what, who can be involved, to more open, spacious, permeable boundaries that really reflect the openness that we see in Jesus Christ.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. Fascinating.
But you're also hinting at the fourth shift. I don't know if you're ready for that yet, but in
Okay.
your illustration,
So just to remind those who are workshopping with us, and we're going to talk about it a little later. And by the way, our workshop today is at 12 noon and not at 11:30, and we're going to have a longer workshop. But just to remind the folk who are workshopping with us, what we're talking about here is the shift from hard boundaries around who does what, how are things done, where does the power lie, who should be involved in conversations. And we're talking about a move or an observation that Lindsay has made when she looks at new worshiping communities, that permeable boundaries regarding conversations and co-creation, etc. This is kind of the way in which we're moving as a church. Is that right? Did I get it? Did I express it right?
beautiful.
Great.
And it's interesting because it's not just a church impulse, it's a human impulse.
Yes.
Because this is coming up in the way businesses of all sizes and configurations are organizing themselves.
Yes.
This is coming up in the way of being with nonprofits. Nobody really does their mission alone anymore. This is internally how we relate, but it's also how we relate with the people in our neighborhood, even if it's geographic or however we're defining neighborhood. But yeah, you said it perfectly.
Great. Okay, let's move on to the next one then. And shift 4, you talk about leadership and how leaders, the sought after leaders for the church were ones that were experts, that were the great preachers. I think of the Riverside Church in New York City and some of the great, churches around the States where the great preacher, was very sought after, or somebody who is a good manager, a good CEO style of senior pastor. But what you're saying is that we're moving towards a more catalytical style. We're looking for the person that will set us off in a new direction or galvanize us into something wonderful. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's true. In today's networked world, anyone can lead. And in an age of institutions, sought after leaders are experts with specific credentials, high levels of expertise. I kind of love that part. I have to confess, I love experts. But in the age of access, the sought after leaders are catalysts. And they may not be the most knowledgeable person about this. I mean, they have to be basically knowledgeable. But the leaders who are sought after are the catalysts who are asking the same questions, sharing similar experiences, and then sparking change, making needed change happen. And this is across the board. It's not just in church. It is the catalysts are the people who get followed. What they do is they give people access to them. So give people access to you and to each other, connect with others, help people connect together. And this is an emerging leadership pattern in the age of access, a pattern in which leadership is virtually available to almost anyone willing. And this is tricky, especially for Presbyterians, because the posture places emphasis not on credentials or training, though they still matters. It's on willingness to lead and ability to connect by articulating the shared questions, the same vision, passion, and then the next steps.
Yes.
Yeah. So the way this is playing out for us is really interesting. Nationwide for the Presbyterian Church USA, 40% of our new worshiping community leaders are not the experts. They're not ordained clergy. They've had no training. In Greater Atlanta, where I am, the shift is even more dramatic. 7 of our 30 current new worshiping community leaders were chosen by the presbytery or a partner church charged with selecting the right leader for a particular church, which means 23 out of 30 leaders rose up from within various communities and networks themselves. That's a huge change, and it's messing with us in terms of polity and all the sorts of things. But it's
it reminds me of a story that I like to tell about Fresh Expressions, Michael Monia, who's written a tremendous amount on Fresh Expressions, he quotes Pope Francis before he was Pope Francis, and what the cardinals said to the consistory of priests in Buenos Aires was, go and hire a garage. And I think he was talking about the industrial area where especially in Buenos Aires, where people change tires and exhausts and mufflers and things like that, and it was a very sort of informal trade. He said, go and hire a garage in the midst of that, and then send a lay person to go and be with those people, and then let him do some catechesis, which for Presbyterians is Bible study, or I guess Sunday school, and then the Archbishop said something wild for Catholics. He said, if they want mass, let him do it. And one of the priests in the consistory said, Father, but if they do that, then they won't come to church. And then he apparently, this is Cardinal Bergoglio, said, do they come now? The answer was no, they don't come. He wasn't talking about church members. He was talking about people who don't want to come to church, but trying to give an accessible way for them to do it. And at no point did he mention a priest, not even in dispensing the sacrament. He spoke about ordinary, everyday people who are the kind of leaders that you're describing, providing access to themselves and catalytical and collaborative, bringing people together. I think this is the way.
Yeah. Well, it's a skill shift. I mean, the skills needed to thrive in this new context, this new era that we live in, they're not gone by any stretch. There's a tremendous amount of overlap, but the skills needed to thrive in the new context, they're dissimilar to those that are well learned and lived by for so many years. It's like, okay, so this is a U.S. example. Sorry, I'm not sure what it's analogous for there, but it's like U.S. football players.
Right.
Now in a world where the game to be played is soccer. Finally, by the way. I mean, the objectives and rules of the game are different. The skills needed are different. And in the age of institutions, the expert ran the show. In an age of access, it's catalysts that have more influence, and they emerge as leaders, not only from credentialing processes,
right,
but also from relationships, shared experiences, desire, and the ability to leverage themselves and anybody and everybody else who would like, all in the service of effecting change that, in the case of the church, they believe God is calling.
So one of the things we're going to have to learn as pastors is to share the space. It may be, and there's no shame in it, that you and I may not be catalytical people, and perhaps we will learn the skill, and perhaps we won't. And if we won't, then I hope we would have the humility to involve others who we know can work with us to accomplishing these ends. Not so.
Yeah. Well, and being on the lookout for the people who are the catalysts. I mean, that's a little bit of the Ormwood story too, right? I mean, going to meet with all the leaders. Sure, some of them were titled and they were in positions of authority and were therefore leaders, and some led well, some led by title. But
yes,
then looking for those catalysts, the catalysts actually get it done. And they're not always who you expect. I mean, I think that in the pandemic, one of the things we're seeing is an interesting shift that combines a couple of the shifts we're talking about. We're seeing this permeable boundaries because suddenly we all had to go online to do church. And so who was needed in leadership to put together a worship service or to think about how to do, congregational care or Bible study or whatever, were people who were really good at technology. And they were not on the staffs of churches. Sure. But suddenly they're in leadership and they're shaping a church. That's a permeable boundary. But they're also, some of them have also been shown to be catalysts who are kind of just get things done. They let go of the command and control leadership and they follow the energy. I could give examples if you want, but
well, perhaps give us one before we go on to the next shift. Tell us about one of the churches in this particular area.
Well, I mean, okay. So it used to be that clergy collected knowledge and credentials and resources first. In other words, become experts with
Okay.
talents and ideas that draw people in. And then they were granted position and place to lead. There's a church right here, Faith, right here means Atlanta, for me. It's called Faith Presbyterian Church, and the leader is Kwasi. And Kwasi A. Addo was actually just a part of the church when they had been without a pastor for a little while.
Mm.
And he, basically, what happened is, I love hearing him tell his story. He's so reticent about doing it, but he's told it to me enough that I remember it. He describes himself as, there I am. I'm just part of the community. They made me the clerk. We were faced with a situation where they needed someone to preach, and I've always been open to God and God's call. So I started hearing God's voice, and I prayed and prayed and prayed about it. And the reality is we needed a church in this area for Ghanaian people. And we didn't find a pastor. By the way, Kwasi is a logistics and supply chain manager. So he's praying and praying and praying, and he doesn't imagine, preaching and becoming a pastor, but basically he knew the struggles of the people. He was asking the same kinds of questions that the people in his community were asking. He knew that there were questions about, okay, so how do you figure out this kind of life in this culture? How, and basically he describes it as, I didn't want to be pastor. I never even thought of myself as pastor, but more and more and more, I found myself in the middle of a group that kept getting things done. And so then he describes it as, so I had no escape. He says, I had no escape. I don't know how to describe the feeling at the time, but it turns out that we kept doing what the community needed. And I kept suggesting things. And slowly but surely, the community kept asking me too if I would preach, if I would do this, if I would do that. And eventually he went to seminary because he felt like he had to, because he's Presbyterian and he wanted the legitimacy. But he told me one time, look, I did not do it in order to lead or be a pastor. I was already doing that. I was already the leader. I was preaching. I was calling other people into preaching. And he basically was the catalyst who accidentally started a church and then started another one because there were more Ghanaian people who couldn't drive that far to get to this. One of those churches is chartered now. Another one is a new one. And he doesn't think about, am I a catalyst or a leader? What he does is he automatically embodies the leadership skills of a catalyst. And he did not have outside authority initially. People gravitated toward him because they had shared experience. He made things happen. He wanted the work to be done. And the community leaned in with him.
Yes.
Not alone. It's not only his story. But Kwasi wound up building a new church that has chartered and owned its own building, all within less than 10 years. At the same time, he started another one. At the same time, he still works logistics and supply full-time. He's a catalyst.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have the expert, but you know what? He's a fantastic, gifted leader.
Wonderful. Great story. And I think one that our ministers and pastors here in Southern Africa would be able to relate to, because I'm sure there are many communities. I know of many communities in rural areas which simply can't afford the services of a full-time pastor. And they have many, many catalytical people, humble, self-effacing people who take responsibility and help the church grow. And yeah, I mean, those people are not shy about saying that they're not experts, but they surely have wonderful gifts, maybe apostolic gifts, for the life and growth of the church. Okay, well, our time is running on, so I think we need to look at number 4. And number 4, we're talking about leadership. Have we done both of them?
We did both of them. Number
Both
4
of
was
them. Wow, the
shift
time
from
has
expert to
gone.
catalyst.
I
But
can't
you're
believe
such
it.
a catalyst that you want to keep getting it done.
Yeah, that's great. So tell me,
Way to
Lindsay,
go, Curious George.
when our group discusses a little bit later at 12 noon, what are some of the questions we want them to think about on these two areas, hard to permeable boundaries and expert to catalyst in terms of leadership? What are some of the questions that we want them to think about?
Yeah. I would be very interested in identifying the stories, seeing where you are already seeing these shifts happening in your own church or in churches you're connected with or in broader culture. Having a conversation about boundaries and your own experience of them. I would imagine there's some people in this community who have run into hard boundaries. And now leaders, at least if you're here in this workshop, you may not run into them as much, but the experience, have a conversation about the experience of boundaries, what that feels like, what it does to you as a person if you've had that experience, or what you imaginatively might guess it does to others. And explore, push on the question of what permeable boundaries and co-creation could bring to the table, where you've seen it in action, and last, how it might look in your own community. Now, the trick is this is a better conversation to have with your actual community rather than just your colleagues, but that's a great place to start. And then the expert to catalyst shift. I would do the exact same thing. I mean, frankly, talk about your favorite experts and why you love them. We Presbyterians are particularly enamored with experts. And what I'm hearing in your story about the preaching is your congregation wanting the expert preacher back in the pulpit. But in the shift from expert to catalyst, what's happening then is leadership is about identifying and lifting up those people who get it done, articulating the vision, the passion, the mission, what needs to happen, and start to share your stories of seeing catalysts in action, whether you consider yourself more expert or more catalyst or like right in the middle, and what it might be to look for catalysts as your next leadership team, like for session or for, I don't know the language you all use, but all ages, not just the people who've paid their dues and have been there long enough. Who are the real catalysts and what kinds of questions are they asking? What are their experiences and what is the change that they really are engaged with deeply, or that they feel like we should be engaged with deeply? Because often those people, whether they are us or not, really do have a pulse on, I mean, it's that sense and respond posture. They have a pulse on what God is doing in the larger context that we might get to be a part of.
Yes. I think that's going to be a great conversation. And can you imagine how much energy, how much enthusiasm can be let loose in the church if we approach the congregation not as users, not as people who come for a service to be rendered unto them, but as potential catalysts who are leaders in various areas and who can lead us and bring the best out of us. I mean, it's incredible. It then our work moves from trying to manage people and say no in a yes kind of way, so they want to do something and we're trying to, in the most polite way possible, tell them it's a silly idea and it can never happen, rather towards encouraging people and encouraging life. I think it could be a revolution.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I look forward to it. We pray for you, Lindsay, because we know it's only 6 a.m. in the morning when you come into this interaction with us today, but for us, it's midday already, because everything begins in Africa long before it begins in the States. Just like life, human life.
We have so much catching up to do, so much.
Lovely. Well, thank you. It's been great again to be with you.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for this time. Many blessings.